I'd like to welcome to the program. Do we have Vanessa Williamson? Vanessa is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and she has written a really fascinating piece in Dissent magazine entitled "The Austerity Politics of White Supremacy." Vanessa, welcome to the program.
Hi, how you doing? Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So this is it dovetails nicely. We spoke yesterday to Adam Gentleson, who has recently written a book about the Senate and the instrument of the filibuster, which ostensibly, really came largely out of a version of white supremacy and sort of was dovetailed with this idea of having an elite, an economic elite, if you will, control essentially and prevent the masses from having some type of political power. And your piece tells a similar story, but with a different device. Tell us where this story begins and what was the impetus for this development of taxpayer concerns.
Well, that's a great question. I think that for me, the question began as I was years ago studying the Tea Party, and I noticed how sort of deeply ingrained in their rhetoric this idea of being a taxpayer was. And, it was fascinating to me because being a taxpayer is mandatory. It's a strange thing to hang your hat on, right? So that was what got me interested in thinking about taxpayer identity, especially on the right. And as I looked into it deeper, it turned out this doesn't just date back to Reagan, which we can all imagine in the sort of hardworking taxpayer as the opponent of the welfare queen, or even back to Goldwater. It dates back all the way to Reconstruction, right? And so literally at the very origin of the first effort of the United States to have a multiracial democracy, when Confederates reorganized themselves to retake power in the South, they did it as taxpayers, right? They claimed to, in fact, quite remarkably, to suddenly, not see color. And this wasn't a matter of color anymore. It was a matter of the taxpayers not getting a fair shake. And what was amazing is how effective that language was.
Okay, so let's walk through this because it really is. I mean, I have, and I think listeners of this program know that I have become over the past couple of years just obsessed with Reconstruction and how much of our present day politics were born in that era and have sadly, in many respects, the dynamic is very similar. Let's go back to South Carolina. You focus on South Carolina. Why South Carolina at this time?
Well, South Carolina, if you're looking for the most Confederate of the Confederates, you'll find them in South Carolina. It also was an interesting situation because in South Carolina, the majority of the population was Black at the time, which meant that if you allowed universal male suffrage to be in place, then most voters would be Black. And in fact, South Carolina had a majority Black legislature under Reconstruction. So it was in South Carolina that white supremacists really confronted most seriously the reality that democracy was anathema to the politics they wanted to achieve, right? And so that's where you see both the most extreme versions of pro-slavery organizing before the war and also among the more extreme reactions afterwards.
So we're talking now like 1870-ish and a couple of years after. And the campaign that was launched was known as the Redemption. Talk about that. It's obviously a very religious word too, but talk about the Redeemers and the Redemption.
So in 1868, South Carolina passes a new state constitution that enfranchises Black men. They elect people to office. You get, as I said, the first time a majority Black legislature in South Carolina. And almost immediately, the opponents of Black freedom start organizing. And they organize in a number of different ways, eventually turning to extreme campaigns of violence and intimidation of Black voters. And by 1876, the Reconstruction is over, right? But the way that they organize is really interesting. Their first campaigns, they tried to motivate first of all, they needed all of the white vote. They didn't need to just suppress the black vote. They needed every white voter on their side. And they were sort of plantation elite were shocked
Can I interrupt?
that they couldn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to interrupt because I also want to just let people know what else was happening concurrently in terms of the vote. This was also at a time where we are just, within a couple of years, the introduction of poll taxes, which have this sort of same, right? We're talking like mid 1870s in some of these states, not so much South Carolina, I think, but it was certainly some of the southern states. And there was multi-pronged efforts to make sure that this notion of universal suffrage, at least amongst men at that time, was not going to kick people, the wealthy, basically out of power. And so there's a couple of different, I just want to make sure that people understand the concurrent forces that were acting here. There was a lot of different things that were being tried to maintain power of these, basically the slave owner class.
That's right. And the slave owner class was trying to appeal to Southern whites who were less wealthy, right? There's a big class divide among Southern white people at the time, presumably still today. And so plantation elite found that this rhetoric of being taxpayers helped reconnect the sort of, the people who had previously been the ruling elite, who had very little time for the sort of Appalachian whites, with the basically subsistence farmers in the upcountry. And the reason that the taxpayer rhetoric worked so well is because Reconstruction governments had to raise taxes, and they'd had to raise them quite a lot, because they were trying to achieve something genuinely extraordinary. Not only were they rebuilding states that were in physical ruin, but they were building for the first time a public school system. And not just for the first time a public school system for Black children, but in most of these states, the first public school system for white children. And so they just needed a lot of money. And so they had to raise land taxes, and it helps give us a wedge issue to the plantation elite.
Well,
and in fact, go on.
Yeah, and it fascinated me too how quick the shift was from overt racism. So you talked about the year 1868. They were in South Carolina talking about how the superior race is made to be subservient to the inferior. And then within 4 years, they are talking about how they're essentially colorblind, and this is all about taxpayers. How quickly was that able to resonate with the poorer whites that you're talking about? Because it seems like such a massive shift from extreme racism to just couched racism, which we still see today.
Yeah, I mean, it was an impressive, I think the first thing to recognize is how impressive it was that rural upcountry whites were willing to vote with the Black majority. I mean, racism had been so deeply embedded into that society. And, what you see in Republican newspapers at the time, the Republican Party being the party of Lincoln and therefore the party of emancipation and freedom, the Republican papers at the time calling on poor white farmers to put aside the question of color and make sure that the rebels did not come back into power, and that was working, but it wasn't given much of an opportunity, not only because plantation whites quickly organized actual paramilitary mobs to keep elections from happening, but also because they were able to appeal to poor white voters who genuinely had seen their taxes gone up, and not the way people complain about their taxes going up today, where it's an inconvenience. We're talking about subsistence level farmers who are really struggling. So they found a wedge issue, and it worked within only 2 or 3 years.
Why was that appeal to vote against the rebels so or to vote in such a way that the rebels are still, sort of, I guess, subjugated? Why was that so resonant with these subsistence farmers?
In the South, plantation owners like to pretend that slavery freed every white man from having to work. The reality was it wasn't true. It made a couple of white people exceptionally rich and, of course, oppressed an entire race of people. But if you weren't a slave owner, you had almost no chance of having any serious amount of wealth. There was no middle class in the American white South. So, and because you were competing both politically and economically with people who literally didn't pay their workforce, there was no way to get ahead. And everyone knew, and this was a big fear before the war too, that if the Appalachian whites ever came to power, they would vote for abolition by taxation. This is one of the reasons why Southern states try so hard, not only to limit democracy at a federal level, but in their states as well. they knew that slavery, even if they didn't feel a moral compunction about what was happening to Black people, they knew that it wasn't in their interest for there to be this aristocratic overclass. So there was longstanding tension between the people closer to the coast with the richer land, large plantations and hundreds of slaves, and then people farther inland who, wanted basic public services, wanted to have the kind of, free land that you could get in the West, that the independence that was possible for a northern farmer.
Was there any type of resentment that we had just gone through this war for not my interests, essentially, and at least a significant amount of the suffering fell upon a group of people who had really nothing to win in this war?
Absolutely. And one of the, people forget now, but I mean, the reason West Virginia is a state is right. Because the mountainous upcountry of Virginia didn't want to do this war, right? And they knew that they didn't want to fight for slavery and for the slaveholders and their wealth. But not everyone who was in, the poorer lands in the upcountry were directly connected to the North, right? Not everyone could do what West Virginia did. But that sentiment existed in many parts of the South.
I'm curious, and this is a little bit off topic, but how that developed. So, okay, maybe we should circle back to that, because they are enticed at the idea. The anger they have at this point is, wow, there's a tremendous amount of taxation relative to what we have for these services, because it's very costly, particularly to get these things up and running when theoretically the economy in these areas has been devastated. Not only has the land, the infrastructure been devastated, but presumably, there has to be new economic models too, that because they had so heavily relied on, like you say, on free labor. And so how does that develop? They within a couple short years, they developed this notion of I guess the Taxpayers Convention, right? In Charleston. Walk us through that.
So I got to tell you about the people who ran the Taxpayers Convention, because they are the most Confederate Confederates that ever confederated. They literally, the leaders included the first senator to leave the Senate after Abraham Lincoln's election. It includes a guy who is the first cousin and grew up in the same household with Preston Brooks. Now, this is a deep cut from American history, but this is the guy who beat Charles Sumner nearly to death on the Senate floor. This is his cousin. And the other guy literally refused to surrender at Appomattox. So if you knew who these people were, it should have been obvious to you that they had not really surrendered and had not committed themselves to this new multiracial democracy. But they organized themselves as this Taxpayers Convention, first in 1871, and then they re-meet in 1874. And it's very clear from their earliest meeting that they recognize the problem is that if Black people can vote, they're never going to hold power again, right? And so that's the problem. They're facing this universal suffrage that they would like to destroy. They test various ideas. They talk a little bit about maybe we can convince white people to move to the South, or maybe we can have a sort of proportional system of voting, but they say themselves this would only be half a loaf when they deserve the whole thing. So what they end up doing is producing these taxpayer leagues, right? And they organize them across South Carolina. The same idea is picked up across the South. And these taxpayer leagues are sort of the midpoint, I would say, between the Democratic Party, which was the party of the white ruling class of the South, and the genuine paramilitary groups, the sort of Ku Klux Klan, red shirts. The taxpayer leagues were sort of in the middle. They had more legitimacy. They weren't as obviously organized exclusively around voter suppression, but they played the same role. And so what you see is these groups, on the one hand, making very sober statements about local budgets and how they've doubled, now that we have to rebuild after a war instead of an entire school system. Amazingly, the budget, it's larger, and this is unacceptable. So they're making these very sober claims that you'd recognize from sort of politics today, the sort of austerity politics talk. In the meantime, they're actually organizing paramilitary groups. They're working with groups like the Red Shirts to first resist taxation, and second, at the point of a gun, push Black lawmakers out of office.
And the reason that the budget had doubled was because the infrastructure had been decimated in the war, and there was also a massive increase in the amount of taxpayers, right? Because of all of the freed Black people after the war. I mean, that's the reason behind that, right?
Yeah, the population, as South Carolina understood it, doubled. right? And it actually left Reconstruction governments in a terrible bind, because what they wanted to do was to be able to tax the slaveholder class. Well, now everyone was free, so you couldn't tax them as precisely as you could have before the war. So you're stuck with these land taxes if you're not going to do land reform. And land reform was too, the idea of just literally dividing up plantations and giving them to the people who had been forced to work on them, that was too extreme, too radical for the time. And so they're trapped trying to figure out how to raise the kind of money they need in an economy that's been decimated when they have twice as many people to look after.
So what was the means of taxing? I just want to remind people that we don't have an income tax for another 50 years almost from this time, more or less, right? In the 19 teens, we get the income tax. So how did they tax at this time if it wasn't?
So there are two kinds of taxes to recognize that were sort of prominent in Southern politics at the time. The first thing to know, though, is that the slaveholder class had kept the taxing capacity of the Southern states in ruins. They literally didn't value the state, like it couldn't value things. So they taxed land by the acre. They didn't tax it whether depending how good the land was. So if you're upcountry, you're paying at the same rate as someone who has like the fancy land that's particularly rich and where the plantations were. So there was no infrastructure in place to make it possible to apply taxes really carefully, and they were building that too. The idea of valuing property at all was a radical change over what had been possible before the war. So their land taxes is the one main thing. And you see the sort of radical Black legislators across the South talking about land taxes as a way, not just to raise money that they desperately needed to build these schools, but also as a way to force plantation owners to sell their property, right? That they wouldn't be able to pay the tax and they could sell the property, and then perhaps freedmen could buy it. That was the dream. So land taxes are one. The other thing was poll taxes. And Reconstruction governments, you see in the legislatures them debating this. They worried that poll taxes could be used to disenfranchise people. But at the same time, they wanted everyone to chip in because they knew that the public school system, especially for Black children, would come under attack right away. So they wanted to make sure that families were chipping in. And one of the things that you see, as Jim Crow solidifies in the decades that follow, is how hard Black communities worked when they were getting their tax dollars just stripped out of their communities, right? To continue to raise money on a voluntary basis to keep those schools open.
Interesting. And liquor was taxed too at this point too, right? I mean, that I imagine must have also created a certain amount of resent.
Yes, in particular, that was not that that dates back all the way to the Whiskey Rebellion. It's hard to imagine today, but money is actually scarce in rural communities at this time. So paying a tax is hard in part because you actually have to get your hands on money, which is not always available. And so, the upcountry whites, not only did they not particularly want to pay taxes on whiskey simply because taxes on whiskey, hit at a product they were very fond of, but whiskey was often used in a form of barter. You could get paid in whiskey. You could pay your rent in whiskey in a lot of these communities. So when you're putting a tax on alcohol, which, in the cities seems like we're basically, this is a sin tax, this is a tax on a luxury good that you don't really need. It is actually really hitting at people's wages and people's, the sort of fundament of their economy. So yeah, the tax on liquor is often an extremely volatile subject.
So, so you write that ultimately, faced with an estimated 60,000 taxpayers and 90,000 voters who pay no taxes, which is reminiscent of Mitt Romney's takers and makers and 47%ers. They settle on three means. They bring the poor whites to their side via this taxation. They intimidate Black voters, and they reclaim power in the state by any means necessary, which is, of course, sort of the pushing, the KKK, but also a series of massacres that really take place. I mean, the Wilmington massacre. You talk about the Vicksburg massacre. I mean, these are happening. They're literally just taking out Black people from the government, essentially, like literally, all very reminiscent of things that have happened in the past week, frankly, in some respects. But so we move on from there. The strategy works, and then what happens? I mean, you cite something that I find just fascinating from an economist, Trevor Logan, finds that public finance was directly related to the, I'm going to quote your piece for you, if you don't mind, directly related to the strength of the violent reaction to Reconstruction. The chances of a local politician being attacked increased 3 percentage points for each additional dollar per capita of tax revenue collected in 1870. That's just extraordinary that you can find that type of relationship between the tax, the resent about taxes, and then how that resent is carried out on black politicians.
Yeah. So what happened in Vicksburg in Mississippi is a good example of this phenomenon. What you see is that tax day comes and the local sheriff, who is the tax collector, is black. And you've got to remember what an absolute revolution had occurred here. We're talking about, when tax collectors were African American, and a fair number of them were among the government officials that came in the Reconstruction period. What you're talking about is for a slaveholder, sometimes someone would come to his property and on behalf of the government and say he had the right to value that property and to impose a tax. That's someone he used to think he owned. This is an extraordinary social revolution that's occurred. So what happens in Vicksburg, the sheriff it's tax day, he's supposed to collect the taxes. A white militia comes and doesn't just refuse to pay the taxes, but demands that all black office holders resign. And it ends up with hundreds of people being killed. And so you see incidents like this across the South, where what starts as an incidents of tax resistance turns into mass murder. Dr. Logan's piece is extraordinarily important because it identifies that these aren't just one-off events. We can talk about sort of anecdotal incidents of violence, right? We don't even have them all recorded, of course, but across the board, what you see in terms of where are legislators most endangered, it is where they had done most to rebuild the tax code. And I think we sometimes think of taxation as a sort of boring side subject, but it's actually really central to our politics. It's not only the way that we pay for the basic goods that make us a democracy, like our schools, but it's also the portion of our labor that we dedicate to our democracy, right? And so it's sort of the lifeblood of democracy, and conservatives recognize that. And they recognized it 150 years ago, and they recognize it today. So what you see is this wave of violence, most extreme where taxes had gone up the most, that is to say, where they had done the greatest work to rebuild what could have been a real multiracial democracy. But the other piece of the fight that Confederates engaged in wasn't just about reaching poor whites, and it wasn't just about the extreme violence against freedmen. It was also about convincing the Northerners, because when it comes down to it, like, why does Reconstruction fail? It fails in a meaningful sense because the North stopped defending it, right? When the Northern Republicans agree to remove federal troops from the South, that is when you see the end of Black suffrage. And so this taxpayer rhetoric sold really well in the North. And the reason for that is partly because some people had gotten extremely rich during the war in the North. They were looking at their cities and seeing influxes of immigrants who were bringing ideas about class consciousness, right? Who were bringing ideas about workers' rights and about unions. And suddenly this idea of universal suffrage didn't sound so great, not just for Black people, but for working men. So in New York City, a campaign was closely fought to actually put basically all the city's powers in a board of finance that would be elected not by all men in the city. Universal suffrage had been in place for decades in New York, but they were going to take those powers and put them in the hands of people elected only by those who had paid something like $500 in taxes that year. This would have disenfranchised half of New Yorkers overnight. So when we're talking, no, go on.
Well, no,
I can talk about this endlessly.
Put raise a flag here, and just this idea that, if on this program I was talking about, hey, there's an attempt to create a finance board, and it's going to be elected just at, it's going to be elected at large, let's say, as opposed to through districts, because to run an at-large campaign, you need a lot more money, and it's not going to be funded by the city. It's not going to be matched donations. And, 80% of the people listening to me would fall asleep like, oh, this is so technical and such irrelevant. But that has been the mechanism in which power is exerted. It is it is made, it submerges a power grab in a technical move. A technical move can also do the opposite as well. It's just that there's a lot of money that finances the development of technical moves to hide power grabs rather than to disperse power grabs. And that's what brought about the North. And we should also note, because of this past week, that one of the reasons why the North also sort of ushered in this, or was willing to stand back and allow Jim Crow to usher in, dealt with a dispute over the Electoral College as well. Just remind us of that. I mean, we've talked about it in the past couple of days, but it's worth how it ties into this story.
That's right. So to maintain their hold on the presidency, the Republican Party was willing to sacrifice the continued presence of federal troops in the South, right? And so we get President Rutherford B. Hayes, and we abandon Black freedmen and the dream of universal male suffrage. And when I was writing, I wrote this piece in October and early November, and I was every day wondered what part of it was. I knew it was going to resonate. I didn't know which parts. And so on Wednesday, it was sort of the nightmare scenario coming true for me. Because I spent a lot of time thinking about the capacity of white supremacist violence to undermine democratic practice in this country, and the capacity of Americans to legitimize with just even the faintest use of the faintest rhetoric that sounds like normal politics, to legitimize extreme violence, and I think obviously there are limits to all historical parallels, but I think that moment, it has a lot to say to us right now. And it has a lot to say to us because, not just because we're actually seeing violent white supremacist mobs, though we are, but because I think there's a real danger that people are going to try and assert that normalcy has returned. And one of the things that they'll point to is, oh, we're just arguing about taxes now. Oh, we're just arguing about budgets now. That's normal politics. These are regular Republicans. But that's why I think it's so important to recognize that the most extreme anti-democratic politics that America has ever seen, in some sense, was accompanied by rhetoric that could be said today.
Right.
Right.
How divorced are these things? Like, I mean, at what point, I think there's an argument that that racism in and of itself is a function, again, of sort of something that is that was born. And I don't know if I fully subscribe to it, but that at the very least, that racism is not necessarily organic. I mean, in the context of those Appalachian subsistence farmers, the racism is sort of a second order issue that develops around the taxation versus the opposite, or at least as a motivating factor. To what extent, I mean, has this dynamic when we talk about taxes, it's born out of a certain racism, but it's ultimately about certain people maintaining certain power and exploiting the racism. Where, has that connection ebbed and flowed over the years? I mean, I can't help but think about Lee Atwater on his deathbed saying, you can't say the N-word anymore, but you can talk about busing, you can talk about taxation. You cite Ronald Reagan and the tax, our tax dollars going to the welfare queens. I mean, it's all bundled up in there. Is it just sort of the relationship sort of like undulates through history, but never breaks apart?
I think that a thing that might shock a contemporary American is the fact that taxation was not a particularly controversial issue in the mid-20th century. Neither party made it a major part of their platform. There was plenty of room for accord on questions of taxes. The time when you see taxes suddenly become an extremely controversial issue is at times when suffrage has expanded, right? And those are two major periods, when suffrage has expanded to poor people. And there are two major periods of that we're talking about today, right? First of all, obviously the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction you might consider our first civil rights movement, and then our second civil rights movement. And the politics is the same politics. We're worried about taxation because suddenly the wrong people, quote unquote, are going to be able to make decisions about what government does, right? And decisions both about how government spends money and decisions about who government taxes. And so it's the taxation really gets at the core tension between a commitment to political equality, which we have never fulfilled but have always claimed, and the reality of economic hierarchy. And of course, in the Reconstruction period, that economic hierarchy had been approximately as extreme as is possible. But it still exists today, and it's still a tension in our politics today, right? We say that we're all, all men are created equal. We say that we have a democracy of equal citizens, but we have an economic system that does not provide equal power to people. And so there's a tension there. And the tension falls heaviest on taxation, right? Because it is the money that turns private property into state power, right? And that tension doesn't go away, but it's much stronger when you see a sudden expansion in the range of people who are allowed to participate, right? And that's why taxation has been an issue my entire lifetime. And that's why taxation was an issue in 1870.
And it was the issue that partially birthed the nation, which is why it's so ironic that the patriots in the South, that they were, or as they were claiming to be, and even now today, they focus on politics of austerity when they've kind of reversed the power relationship. It's kind of the inverse there. So, I mean, you can make an argument that issues over power in taxation are at the forefront of, or at the core of, every apex, every moment, important, punctuated moment in our history and in our current politics.
That's exactly right. I mean, because of the strength of anti-tax politics today, people sometimes misread onto the founders an anti-tax attitude, but they were no more anti-tax than they were anti-law, right? Because they didn't want the British taxing them. They didn't want Britain writing laws for America either, right? But that didn't mean that they didn't think taxes or laws should be implemented with representation. They certainly did think those things should be. But it does. It's exactly that. You're exactly right. That the question of who governs, it hits home when it's tax dollars.
Well, so is it ultimately a fear? It's a fear of a loss of political power, and political power in the context of our government is really just where resources are dedicated to, right? And who gets the bounty of government. I mean, if government just built, high-end golf courses, there may not be as much of a concern about taxation, right? I mean, like that, I'm just trying to tease out that as we get emancipatory movements, it starts a whole nother series of generations of tax complaints. Because when you talk about the 40s and 50s, you're talking about in the early 60s, you're talking about highest marginal tax rates at what would be equivalent to $3 million today. And every dollar after that, 90 cents goes to the government. 90 cents after every dollar after 3 million. And then the Civil Rights Act happens, and all of a sudden, it's like within a decade, the tax rate is a third of that. Is it the distribution of the money? Is it the confiscation of the money? Is it just the notion of lack of control, or is it just sort of hard to disaggregate all those things?
I think that there is, one of the things that's striking about the Civil War is, of course, Abraham Lincoln wasn't going to free the slaves. I mean, he did free the slaves because of the war, right? And he was personally opposed to slavery. He said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But he wasn't planning a great abolitionist campaign. And, and I think there's some similarities now that conservative politics asserts, the threat of communism today. Joe Biden.
Right.
There's a real gap there between the politics that is likely to be implemented and the rhetorical claims of the conservative side. So I think that there tends to be a real disconnect, a sort of drama, you might call it, when it comes to talking about what the other side might do. And in some ways, it brings about its own defeat. At least it has historically. There was a great piece I read recently, someone who studied the rhetoric of congressmen before the Civil War and from the South. And of course, they were constantly giving these, speeches about terrible oppression they were facing and how the South, but they were just ginning up their base. They didn't mean it. Of course, they were friends with the other congressmen. This was just, red meat for the base. And then it kind of got out of their hands. And some of them were genuinely surprised by what happened. And so I think that, the actual dangers posed by, for example, the expansion of democracy to universal suffrage does not necessarily result in progressive taxation. You actually see progressive taxation come in when you have major wars, right? So it's the fear that you can't, the fear of democracy, I think, is sometimes more extreme than it needs to be, and actually, in some sense, provokes emancipatory movements. They're constantly seeing emancipatory movements when sometimes they're not even ready. They're not even there, but and that's what you see in the Civil War.
It's fascinating. It's slightly irrational on some level, which suggests that maybe it comes back to just simply just an overall fear and an ignorance that is, sometimes difficult to distinguish from racism or anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, it's a fascinating piece. Vanessa Williamson, folks can find it in Dissent magazine. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.